The desperate Plath communications array on Zelani Station hummed with its usual gentle frequency, processing routine trade requests and diplomatic messages between the peaceful worlds of the Outer Rim. Communications. Officer Kira Nethys adjusted. Her bioluminescent headset, her pale green skin glowing softly in the dim light of the control room. The Zelani had evolved on a world of eternal twilight, and their technology reflected their preference for subtle, organic interfaces. Everything about their civilization spoke of harmony and careful balance. That harmony shattered when the emergency signal pierced through the standard channels like a scream in the night. Kira's 4 eyes widened as the priority alert flashed, crimson across her organic display screen. Her delicate fingers, each ending in sensitive nerve clusters, trembled as she opened the communication channel. What she heard made her blood run cold with a terror her species had never known. The voice belonged to Governor Talon Corvex of the Meridian system, but it was barely recognizable through the static and explosions in the background. His words came in desperate bursts between what sounded like the roar of massive engines and the crack of energy weapons. The proud Zelani governor, who had once spoken eloquently at the Galactic Council about the virtues of peaceful coexistence, now begged. For his life and the lives of his people, the Korath Dominion had come to Meridian. Their massive dreadnoughts had emerged from hyperspace without warning, their hulls black as the void between stars and bristling with weapons that could crack planets. The Korath were an ancient species, older than most civilizations in the galaxy, and they had spent millennia perfecting the art of conquest. They did not negotiate, they did not show mercy, and they had never been defeated in open warfare. Governor Corvex's transmission painted a picture of absolute devastation. The Korath bombardment had begun immediately upon their arrival, targeting not just military installations, but civilian centers, hospitals, and schools. Their ground forces were already landing on 3 of Meridian's inhabited worlds, and preliminary reports suggested they were taking no prisoners. The governor's voice broke as he described seeing the orbital defense platforms, structures that had taken decades to build, reduced to glowing debris in minutes. Kira immediately forwarded the transmission to the Zelani High Council, but she already knew what their response would be. The Zelani were a peaceful species, evolved from creatures that had survived through cooperation and symbiosis rather than conflict. Their military existed primarily for asteroid mining and rescue operations. They had no weapons capable of challenging the Korath war machine, no soldiers trained for the kind of brutal combat that was now consuming the Meridian system. Within hours, similar distress calls began flooding in from across the Outer Rim. The Korath advance was not limited to Meridian. They were launching a coordinated assault on multiple systems simultaneously, their forces moving with a precision that spoke of years of careful planning. The attacks followed a pattern that military analysts would later recognize as brilliant in its cruelty. The Korath targeted the most peaceful worlds first, those with the smallest defense forces and the largest civilian populations. They were not just conquering territory. They were sending a message to the galaxy about the futility of resistance. Galactic Council convened an emergency session within 12 hours of the first attack. The Great Chamber on Concordia Prime had been designed to facilitate peaceful discussion between species, its flowing architecture and soft lighting intended to promote harmony and understanding. Now it buzzed with panic and desperation as representatives from hundreds of worlds tried to comprehend the scale of the crisis unfolding before them. Chancellor Vos Naueth of the Centauri Republic called the session to order, his normally composed demeanor cracking under the weight of the news reports streaming in from the affected systems. The Centauri had always prided themselves on their diplomatic skills, believing that any conflict could be resolved through careful negotiation and compromise. Now they faced an enemy that seemed to view diplomacy as weakness and negotiation as an invitation to attack. Ambassador Lyra Voss of the Zelani Federation stood to address the council, her bioluminescent skin flickering with distress patterns. That spoke of deep fear. Her species communicated as much through color and light as through words, and every being in the chamber could see her terror. She had lost contact with 3 of her home worlds in the past 6 hours, and the fragmentary reports she was receiving painted a picture of systematic annihilation. The assembled representatives listened in growing horror as Ambassador Voss detailed the Korith advance. The enemy fleet was massive, numbering in the thousands of vessels, and it moved with a coordination that suggested a level of military planning that few species could match. Their weapons were devastating, capable of reducing entire cities to ash from orbit, and their ground forces showed a level of brutality that shocked even hardened military observers. One by one, the major powers of the galaxy offered their responses to the crisis, and one by one, they found reasons to avoid direct confrontation with the Korith. The Andromedan collective claimed that their forces were already committed to defending their own borders. The Silicon Confederacy argued that their crystalline warriors were incompatible with the biological warfare techniques that the Korith employed. The Aquatic Alliance stated that their soldiers could not function on the dry worlds that the Korith were targeting. Each excuse was technically valid, but Ambassador Voss could see the truth in their bioluminescent displays and hear it in their careful diplomatic language. They were afraid. The Korith Dominion had a reputation that stretched back centuries, and every species in the galaxy knew the stories of their conquests. Worlds that resisted were burned to ash. Worlds that surrendered quickly were allowed to live as slaves. There was no middle ground, no negotiation, no hope for mercy. The debate continued for hours, but it became increasingly clear that the Galactic Council would not act. The mathematics of this situation were stark and unforgiving. The Korith had spent generations building their war machine, creating a military force that could challenge the combined fleets of multiple species. Even if the Council could organize a unified response, which seemed increasingly unlikely given the political complications involved, the casualties would be enormous. As the formal session drew to a close with no concrete action taken, Ambassador Voss found herself in the position of watching her civilization die, while the galaxy's leaders offered empty words of sympathy and regret. The Zelani had been founding members of the Galactic Council, contributing their skills in biotechnology and peaceful conflict resolution to the greater community. Now that community was abandoning them in their hour of greatest need. It was then that she remembered the humans. The memory came to her as she sat in her quarters aboard the Concordia Prime orbital station, staring out at the stars and wondering which of them were already burning under Korith bombardment. 3 years earlier, the Galactic Council had received a request for membership from a species calling itself humanity. The application had been unusual in several ways, not least because it came from a world that most civilized species would consider uninhabitable. Earth, as the humans called their home world, was classified as a Class 12 death world, a rating reserved for planets where the environment itself seemed actively hostile to life. The atmospheric composition included significant amounts of corrosive oxygen. The weather patterns were violent and unpredictable, and the native life forms were dominated by predators and parasites. The planet's gravity was nearly twice that of most inhabited worlds, and its surface was scarred by active volcanism and frequent seismic activity. Most species would have dismissed any claim that intelligent life could evolve on such a world. But the humans had not only survived their hellish environment, they had thrived in it. Their application to the Galactic Council had been accompanied by detailed records of their technological development, and those records painted a picture of a species that had been forged by constant struggle against an environment that seemed determined to kill them. The humans had evolved as persistence hunters, capable of pursuing prey across vast distances in conditions that would exhaust most other predators. They were omnivores, able to derive nutrition from an enormous variety of sources, and their immune systems were so robust that they could survive exposure to pathogens that would kill most galactic species within hours. Most remarkably, they seemed to view their hostile environment not as a curse to be endured, but as a challenge to be overcome. Their early technological development had followed patterns that other species found disturbing. While most civilizations developed energy weapons and defensive shields, humans had focused on kinetic weapons and armor systems. They had learned to wage war in the depths of their oceans, in the frozen wastes of their polar regions, and in the crushing depths of their underground cave systems. Every environment on their world had taught them new ways to fight and survive. When the humans had finally achieved spaceflight, their approach had been characteristically aggressive. Rather than cautiously exploring their immediate stellar neighborhood, they had launched ambitious missions to every world in their system, establishing colonies in environments that other species would consider uninhabitable. They had built cities in the crushing gravity wells of gas giant moons, mining operations in the radiation-soaked asteroid belts, and research stations in the frozen outer reaches where temperatures dropped to near absolute zero. The Galactic Council had accepted humanity's membership application with considerable reluctance and significant debate. Many species found the humans' approach to problem-solving unsettling, while others were concerned about the implications of admitting a species that seemed to thrive on conflict and challenge. The humans had been granted membership primarily because their technological innovations were proving valuable, particularly in fields related to hostile environment operations and resource extraction. In the 3 years since their admission to the Council, the humans had kept largely to themselves, focusing on expanding their presence in their home system and conducting limited trade with a few of the more adventurous species. They had participated in several council sessions, but their representatives had been notably quiet during most debates. When they did speak, their suggestions often involved solutions that other species found uncomfortably direct. Now, as Ambassador Voss contemplated the destruction of her civilization, she found herself wondering if the humans' aggressive approach to problem-solving might be exactly what the situation demanded. The Korath Dominion had never faced an enemy that fought with the same brutality and determination that they employed. Every species they had conquered had followed the standard patterns of galactic warfare, with carefully planned campaigns, limited objectives, and rules of engagement designed to minimize casualties. The humans, she realized, had never learned those rules. They came from a world where survival required constant vigilance and overwhelming response to threats. They had evolved in an environment where showing weakness or hesitation meant death, and they had carried that mentality with them into space. If any species in the galaxy was capable of matching the Korath's brutality with their own, it would be the humans. The decision to contact Earth was not made lightly. Ambassador Voss spent the night reviewing everything the Galactic Council knew about humanity, studying their military capabilities, and trying to understand their psychology. What she found both encouraged and terrified her. The humans possessed a level of technological sophistication that was impressive, even by galactic standards. But their approach to warfare was unlike anything other species employed. Human military doctrine seemed to be based on the principle of overwhelming force applied with devastating precision. They had developed weapons that other species considered unnecessarily destructive, and their tactical philosophy emphasized speed, aggression, and the complete elimination of enemy resistance. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to view casualties not as unfortunate necessities, but as acceptable costs in achieving their objectives. Yet, despite their apparent brutality, the humans had also demonstrated a capacity for sacrifice and heroism that was remarkable even by galactic standards. Their history was filled with examples of individuals and groups who had risked everything to protect others, often people they had never met. They seemed to possess an almost instinctive drive to defend the innocent and punish those who preyed. On the week dot as dawn broke over Concordia Prime, Ambassador Voss made her decision. The formal diplomatic channels had failed, and the Galactic Council was paralyzed by fear and political considerations. The Korath advance was continuing, and with each passing hour, more worlds fell to their brutal conquest. If the Zelani Federation was to survive, they needed an ally who was not bound by the careful protocols and cautious strategies that had proven inadequate against the Korath war machine. The message she sent to Earth was simple and direct, crafted in the style that she hoped would appeal to human sensibilities. It contained no flowery diplomatic language or careful political qualifications. Instead, it was a straightforward plea for help from one species to another, an appeal to the human sense of justice and their apparent willingness to fight for what they believed was right. The transmission was sent using the fastest available communication methods, routed through the Galactic Communication Network with the highest priority classification. Ambassador Voss estimated that it would reach Earth within 36 hours, and she could only hope that the humans would respond before it was too late. The Korath advance was accelerating, and intelligence reports suggested that they were already preparing for the next phase of their campaign dot in the depths of space, traveling at speeds that bent the laws of physics. Her message raced toward a small blue world on the edge of the galaxy. It carried with it the hopes and fears of billions of beings, and the desperate prayer that somewhere in the universe there existed a species willing to stand against the darkness that was consuming the stars. Asterisk. Deathworlders unleashed the message from Ambassador Voss, reached Earth's orbital defense. Command at 0347 hours Greenwich Mean Time, during the quiet hours when most of the planets slept peacefully beneath the protective shield of their defense satellites. The duty officer, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun, had been reviewing routine patrol reports when the priority alert screamed across her display, screamed with an urgency that made her blood run cold. Lieutenant Commander Chun had served in Earth's military for 15 years, participating in the brutal conflicts that had marked humanity's expansion into space. She had fought in the asteroid belt wars, where combat took place in the crushing gravity wells around Jupiter, and she had commanded rescue operations in the radiation-soaked ruins on the failed Mars colonies. She had seen death and destruction on a scale that would horrify most galactic species, but as she read the message from the Zelani Federation, she felt a familiar rage building in her chest. The Korath Dominion's campaign of conquest was not warfare as humans understood it. It was systematic extermination, the deliberate targeting of civilian populations, and the destruction of entire civilizations for no purpose other than to demonstrate power. The fragmentary reports included in the transmission painted a picture of brutality that offended every principle that humanity held sacred. Children were being slaughtered in their schools. Hospitals were being bombed from orbit, and entire populations were being enslaved or killed based on nothing more than their inability to resist. Chun immediately forwarded the message to Admiral Marcus Rodriguez, the commanding officer of Earth's Orbital Defense Force. Rodriguez was a veteran of humanity's most brutal conflicts, a man who had earned his rank by leading from the front and never asking his soldiers to take risks that he would not take himself. He had lost an arm during the siege of Europa Station and walked with a limp from shrapnel wounds received during the Battle of Titan, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. The Admiral's response was immediate and unequivocal. Within minutes of receiving the message, he had issued orders to begin mobilizing Earth's fleet for deep space operations. The bureaucratic procedures that would have paralyzed other species were swept aside with the brutal efficiency that characterized human military operations. Resources were allocated, personnel were recalled from leave, and ships were prepared for combat with a speed that would have seemed impossible to observers from other species. General Sarah Mitchell, Earth's most experienced ground combat commander, was awakened at her home in the Colorado mountains and briefed on the situation via secure communication. Mitchell was a small woman with graying hair and calm brown eyes, but her appearance was deceptive. She had commanded ground forces during the most vicious battles of humanity's expansion, and her tactical innovations had revolutionized the way humans fought in hostile environments. Mitchell's reputation had been forged during the Proxima Rebellion, when colonists on humanity's first interstellar settlement had declared independence and taken civilian hostages. The siege had lasted 6 months, with fighting conducted in the tunnels beneath the colony's main city. Mitchell had led her forces through conditions that would have been impossible for most species to endure, ultimately breaking the rebellion through a combination of superior tactics and sheer determination. As reports of the Korath advance continued to reach Earth, the scope of the crisis became increasingly clear. This was not a limited conflict or a territorial dispute. The Korath were launching a war of annihilation against the peaceful species of the Outer Rim, and they were doing so with a level of brutality that shocked even hardened military observers. Their forces were systematically destroying everything that represented civilization and progress, leaving only death and slavery in their wake. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Earth's leading expert on alien psychology and warfare, was brought in to analyze the intelligence reports and develop recommendations for combating the Korath threat. Vasquez had spent years studying the military capabilities of various galactic species, and her insights had proven invaluable during humanity's integration into the galactic community. She possessed a unique understanding of how different species approached warfare, and her analysis of Korath tactics revealed several critical weaknesses. The Korath, Vasquez concluded, had developed their military doctrine based on centuries of fighting enemies who adhered to the standard patterns of galactic warfare. Their tactics were designed to counter energy weapons, long-range bombardment, and the careful, methodical approach that most species employed in combat. They had never faced an enemy that fought with the brutal efficiency and overwhelming aggression that characterized human military doctrine. Human weapons technology was fundamentally different from what the Korath had encountered before. While most galactic species had developed sophisticated energy weapons and defensive shields, humans had focused on kinetic weapons that delivered devastating physical force. Human military doctrine emphasized close-quarters combat, rapid deployment, and the complete destruction of enemy forces, rather than the careful, limited engagements preferred by other species. Captain James Rodriguez, no relation to the Admiral, commanded the elite 1st Reconnaissance Battalion, humanity's most experienced deep space combat unit. Rodriguez was a veteran of conflicts that had taken him to the most hostile environments in the solar system, and his unit had earned a reputation for accomplishing missions that other forces considered impossible. His soldiers were trained to fight in zero-gravity, toxic atmospheres, and radiation fields that would kill most galactic species within minutes. The human fleet that assembled in Earth orbit was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The ships were designed to operate in the hostile environment of space without the elaborate life support systems that other species required. Human vessels were armored to withstand impacts from asteroids traveling at interplanetary velocities, and their hulls were designed to handle the crushing gravitational fields near black holes and neutron stars. The flagship of the fleet was the USS Vengeance, a heavy cruiser commanded by Admiral Rodriguez himself. The ship had been designed for extended operations in deep space, with redundant systems and armor that could withstand damage that would destroy vessels from other species. Its weapons were a mixture of kinetic projectiles and energy weapons, but its real strength lay in its ability to deliver ground forces to hostile environments. Colonel Maria Santos commanded the 3rd Expeditionary Force, 5,000 of Earth's most experienced ground combat troops. Santos had earned her rank during the bloody urban warfare that had characterized the Mars Rebellion and her tactical innovations had become standard doctrine for human ground forces. Her soldiers were equipped with powered armor that allowed them to fight in environments ranging from the frozen surfaces of ice worlds to the superheated atmospheres of volcanic planets. The human approach to military logistics was another area where their Deathworld origins provided significant advantages. Human supply lines were designed to function in environments where traditional logistics would be impossible. Their forces could operate for extended periods without resupply, and their equipment was built to function in conditions that would disable the technology of other species. As the human fleet prepared to depart Earth orbit, messages of support began arriving from across the solar system. The mining colonies in the asteroid belt offered their industrial capacity to support the war effort. The research stations around the outer planets provided intelligence and technical support. Even the civilian population of Earth itself contributed resources and personnel with an enthusiasm that would have seemed impossible to other species. The journey to the Zelani system would take 3 weeks, using humanity's fastest interstellar drives. During that time, the human forces prepared for a type of warfare that the galaxy had never seen before. They studied the intelligence reports from the Korath advance, analyzing enemy tactics and developing countermeasures. They trained in the hostile environment of deep space, preparing for combat in conditions that would challenge even their enhanced capabilities. Dr. Vasquez continued her analysis of Korath psychology and tactics, developing psychological warfare strategies that would exploit the enemy's weaknesses. The Korath, she realized, had never faced an enemy that seemed to thrive on the brutality and chaos of combat. Their entire military doctrine was based on intimidation and overwhelming force, tactics that were effective against species that feared death and suffering. Humans, however, had evolved on a world where death and suffering were constant companions. They had learned to function in environments that would break the spirit of most species, and they had developed a psychological resilience that was unmatched in the galaxy. More importantly, they possessed a moral code that made them willing to sacrifice themselves for the protection of others, a trait that would prove crucial in the battles to come. The human fleet reached the edge of the Zelani system to find a scene of devastation that exceeded their worst expectations. The Korath fleet filled the space around Zelani Prime like a swarm of metallic locusts, their massive dreadnoughts systematically bombarding the planet's surface, while smaller vessels hunted down fleeing civilian transports. The orbital defense platforms that had once protected the peaceful world were nothing but expanding clouds of debris, and the planet's surface was scarred by the fires of orbital bombardment. Admiral Rodriguez stood on the bridge of the USS Vengeance, studying the tactical display with the calm focus that had made him one of humanity's most successful military commanders. The odds were overwhelming. The Korath fleet outnumbered the human forces by more than 10 to 1, and their individual ships were larger and more heavily armed than anything in the human arsenal. By every conventional measure, the approaching battle was hopeless. But humans had never been conventional, and Admiral Rodriguez had not traveled across the galaxy to engage in conventional warfare. The tactics he employed in the coming battle would violate every principle of galactic military doctrine, and they would succeed precisely because no one had ever been insane enough to attempt them before. The first human strike came without warning, and without the formal declarations of war the Galactic Convention demanded. Captain Rodriguez's reconnaissance battalion, riding in fast attack craft designed for stealth operations, penetrated the Korath formation and struck at their command. Vessels with kinetic weapons that punched through alien armor like it was paper. The Korath response was immediate and overwhelming, but the human forces had already scattered, using their superior maneuverability to avoid the massive energy weapons that other species would have tried to withstand. Colonel Santos led the Ground assault on Zelani Prime, her forces dropping directly into the heart of the Korath occupation zone in armored pods that would have killed any other species on impact. The Korath ground forces had never faced enemies who seemed to view suicidal charges as standard tactics, and their carefully planned defensive positions were overrun by human soldiers who fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness. Battle for Zelani Prime raged for 72 hours, with fighting that would have been impossible for any species other than humans to sustain. The Korath forces found themselves facing enemies who seemed to grow stronger as the battle intensified. Soldiers who used the rubble of destroyed cities as cover and turned the Korath's own weapons against them. Human tactics were unpredictable, brutal, and devastatingly effective against an enemy that had never learned to adapt to changing conditions in space. Admiral Rodriguez employed strategies that would have been considered war crimes by galactic standards. Human ships rammed Korath vessels at velocities that should have destroyed both craft, but the human vessels were designed to survive such impacts, while their alien opponents were not. Human boarding parties fought hand-to-hand in the corridors of Korath ships, using combat techniques that other species found barbaric but devastatingly effective. The turning point came when Dr. Vasquez's psychological warfare strategies began to take effect. The Korath had never faced an enemy that seemed to welcome death as eagerly as victory, and their morale began to crack under the pressure of fighting opponents who treated their own survival as secondary to the mission. Reports began filtering through the Korath communication networks of human soldiers who continued fighting even after sustaining wounds that should have been fatal, of human ships that kept fighting even after their hulls had been breached and their crews exposed to vacuum. The final phase of the battle was characterized by a level of brutality that shocked even the humans themselves. Colonel Santos led her forces in a direct assault on the Korath command center, fighting through defenses that had been designed to withstand siege warfare conducted by civilized species. The human assault was neither civilized nor conventional, and it succeeded through sheer determination and overwhelming violence. When the smoke cleared and the last Korath resistance was crushed, the surviving alien forces faced a choice that their species had never before been forced to make. They could continue fighting against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each battle, or they could retreat and face the consequences of failure. A decision was made for them when Admiral Rodriguez broadcasted a message that would become legend throughout the galaxy. The message was simple and direct, delivered in the calm tone that characterized human military communications. The Admiral informed the Korath forces that humanity had come to protect the innocent and punish those who preyed on the weak. Any Korath forces that remained in the system would be destroyed without mercy. Any Korath ships that fled would be hunted down and eliminated. The campaign of terror against the peaceful species of the Outer Rim was over. The Korath retreat was as swift as their advance had been, but it came too late to save their reputation. Word of their defeat spread throughout the galaxy with unprecedented speed, carried by refugee ships and diplomatic communications to every corner of known space. The species that had dominated galactic warfare for centuries had been broken by a force they had never encountered before, and the implications of their defeat would reshape the balance of power throughout the galaxy. As the human fleet prepared to return to Earth, they left behind a changed galaxy. The peaceful species of the Outer Rim no longer faced the terror of Korath conquest, but they had also learned that protection came at a price. Humanity had demonstrated that they were willing to fight for the innocent, but they had also shown that their methods were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The reputation of humanity as protectors and warriors spread quickly through diplomatic channels and refugee testimonies. A species that had once dismissed humans as barbaric primitives from a death world now viewed them with a mixture of gratitude and fear. The galaxy had gained a new protector, but it had also gained a new force that would reshape the nature of warfare itself in the aftermath of the battle. As rescue ships worked to evacuate survivors and begin the long process of rebuilding, Ambassador Voss transmitted a message of gratitude to Earth. Her words were simple but profound, expressing the debt that her people owed to the humans who had traveled across the galaxy to answer their call for help. The message concluded with a promise that would define the relationship between humanity and the peaceful species of the galaxy for generations to come. The age of Korath dominance was over, and the age of human protection had begun. ****